podcast where we talk about early childhood topics. I'm so excited today because I have and my name is Marisa Macy, and I'm the host of the Buttercup podcast. And I'm so excited today because I have Dr. Scott Chamberlin, who is a professor at the University of Wyoming in the field of mathematics education. His research interests include the use of problem-solving activities and gifted students. Specifically, he investigates student affect and creativity as they relate to mathematical problem solving. Recently, Dr. Chamberlin validated the Chamberlin Affective Instrument for Mathematical Problem Solving, CAIMPS, and it is used by classroom teachers to formally assess student affect as they complete problem-solving tasks in mathematics. Another interest of Dr. Chamberlin pertains to student development of highly creative mathematical solutions while completing mathematical problem-solving tasks. Much of this work is a direct result of his work with Model-eliciting Activities, MEAs. MEAs are problem-solving tasks in which solvers are expected to create mathematical models to explain and generate understanding about phenomena and concepts in mathematics. Welcome, Dr. Chamberlin.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I couldn't have written it better myself. That was just terrific of you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for being here today on the
Yeah.
Buttercup podcast. Well, how did you get started in education?
We have had I guess two predominant vocations in our family. So a lot of teachers, a lot of people in education, and then a lot of folks historically, not as much anymore, in the agricultural industry. So those of us who lived in town often became teachers, and those of us who lived in the country became farmers. And how I got to this stage of being a professor is I just had a pretty burning interest in I guess there are two answers to that, in learning about gifted education and its intersection with mathematics education, which is why the focus of my dissertation. And then I guess like all other professors, and you're a professor, we just couldn't figure out what we wanted to do until late in life. So we continued to go to school. But it's been really, really engaging for me to teach students in the K through 6. And actually, I taught a little bit. I taught some seventh grade as well, classroom, and now to work with college students and to engage in scholarly activity and research.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And what is gifted education and what does it mean to be twice exceptional?
There are a lot of conceptions of gifted education, but really fundamentally it boils down to serving through challenging and helping develop our most capable students. One of the things that is done a lot, at least in the States here, is that we have a tendency to look at students as qualifying for gifted services if they score high enough on one or more tests. Historically, if we go back 100 years ago, the IQ test was used, and then it was revealed that there's some perhaps faults with that, and that it was a very unidimensional representation of individuals' capabilities. So other things are used now. We rely heavily on literacy and mathematics assessments and metrics, but I would caution listeners that giftedness is well beyond just being boiled down to literacy and mathematics. That's traditionally what schools do. There's so many other capabilities out there, and we might get into a few of them today as we explore eminent individuals. Twice exceptionality, or twice exceptional students, if we think about the individuals, pertains to individuals, and this is no more complex, although once one gets into it, it can get pretty complex. It's really no more complex than skills that individuals have in situations where there appears to be an advancement in one area, and it can be considered a deficit or a challenge, whatever word one chooses to use in another area. Some of those can be physical, some of those are cognitive. And so it really encompasses individuals who seem to have, I wouldn't say an advantage, but some advanced capabilities in one area and who require some additional assistance in another area. Historically, we tend to boil this down to its most basic level, and we go back to individuals who are advanced in one of the two areas that we discussed earlier, mathematics or English language arts. And it's far more complex, and there's much, much more depth to it than that. But it is possible, certainly, to have a third grader who is very, very advanced in mathematics and who has a reading deficit or a writing deficit or a spelling or something else. It is, of course, much more complex than that. Somebody, we could have an individual young girl who is really, really advanced in physics and in mathematical abilities and who has some who has asthma or who has a physical challenge, maybe a mobility issue, maybe someone who has a sight, vision or a hearing impairment. And then it could be somebody, that is who is advanced in um, spatial reasoning. It could be someone who is advanced in kinesthetic capabilities and who has a deficit or a challenge in another area. And so, twice exceptionality, we want to be careful. Couple of things about it. We want to be careful not to restrict it just to those things that are assessed in K through 12 schools, be they public or private. It goes well beyond that. The other interesting finding in the research, and we can pursue this to as much or little as you want today, but one of the findings that sort of recurs from the research is that many teachers, trained teachers, in-service teachers, teachers who have been teaching for 5, 10 years, aren't even aware that twice exceptionality exists, the whole concept. And the research also shows that teachers have a tendency to gravitate in situations in which there is an advancement in one area and a particular need in another area. Teachers have a tendency to use a deficit learning model. So they'll see the deficit in one area and be convinced, well, the student or the learner could certainly not be advanced in another area because there's a deficit. So there are two lenses from which to view this. There's sort of the CEC, which isn't exclusively, but it's predominantly comprised of special ed folks. And they have one sort of perspective of it. It's really sort of fundamentally the same thing. And then it also has a house in the world of gifted education. So, not surprisingly, the gifted ed folks tend to look at the advancement in an area and say, "Oh, well, this is a challenge or a special need or a deficit on which we need to work." And the folks in special education tend to look at the deficit and say, "Well, we should probably serve the advancement as well." So, it's a really complex, moniker and situation. And a lot of people aren't altogether sure how to handle it, obviously, because, and these also can appear in 504s and IEPs, right? That somebody might have a particular need in one area, but has an advancement in another area.
Yes, and I'm so glad you brought up IEPs and
Hmm.
504 plans. Um, I when I was a special education teacher, I had a student who was twice exceptional,
Hmm.
and the student's exceptionality was health impairment, other health
Hmm.
impairment, OHI, and our and and the student was gifted. And what the family and the rest of the team decided, and the student also, was we were going to exit the IDEA special education IEP. The family and parents didn't think uh, the student needed it anymore, and so that's what we did. But what we did was instead of just taking away all supports uh, and just exiting cold turkey, we wrote a 504 plan so that students' health impairment could continue being addressed by the general education program and curriculum. And so that's kind of what we did with the 504 plan. But
Yeah, and a
oh,
lot
go
of
ahead.
times parents aren't aware of this. Sorry. A lot of times parents aren't aware that this whole concept of being twice exceptional exists. Many schools are, and we even have I've seen some evidence of this. So there are schools out there that want to move students off of IEPs because they're a lot of work and gravitate them to in the direction of a 504, or if they're on a 504, remove them altogether from a 504. What happens as a default in many schools is there's ample money for services for students who require some additional attention, who have some deficits or some challenges or some special needs, but they often will not choose to serve the gifted chunk of that because they don't really feel that it's a particular need and it may not be funded and the state may not mandate it. And so it's kind of a precarious position in which to be as a young learner.
Thank you.
Mhm,
Well, college students listen to this podcast,
mhm.
and uh, you study creativity and also um, diverse students and abilities. If a student teacher or a teacher wanted to serve students who were twice exceptional or gifted, uh, do you have any tips or suggestions or ideas that could be implemented?
Yeah, it's a little like running a marathon, believe it or not. It's a long haul. There's a bunch of time invested in it. And I think when, I know this sounds maybe a little trite or a little bit silly, but I think when one embraces the idea that this is going to be a lot of work, one has enhances the likelihood that he or she can be more successful than just, oh, I'll serve the student as things as needs arise. So try to be as proactive as possible. There are certain things that fall under the umbrella of being twice exceptional or a particular need, maybe documented in a 504 or IEP, that should be served every single day. For instance, if somebody has a vision impairment, there are, and I don't want to minimize it to, oh, we'll just make the print bigger. It's not necessarily that easy. But there are certain approaches in place that can enable one to serve that student. And that may be the only real particular challenge that needs served. But all of these things, when one is twice exceptional, sort of are overlaid, right? So if you have somebody with, let's take a quote unquote relatively easy one, although I wouldn't say that's real easy for those of us who have served someone with a vision impairment. If somebody has a vision impairment and they're really, really advanced in one subject, that's certainly going to take some effort. It's relatively easy to serve. The issue becomes when we get folks who are, if we think about a standard bell curve, who are extremely advanced in one area and have a particularly high time intensive need in another area. So if someone is emotionally disturbed, but yet extremely advanced in some other area, autistic children would fall under this umbrella. And so what's really amazing to me is that the number of students identified as twice exceptional is a really, really small percentage of the individuals. Most folks who know something about it, a lot more than me, would claim they're probably a heck of a lot more than that. But this is going to be time intensive on behalf of a student teacher. One of the things that I tell our student teachers is this is a fantastic opportunity for you to be able to serve someone under, with the direction of a capable mentor teacher because that person might be able to hold your hands. The mentor teacher may know how to serve one of the two needs, and you get to figure out the other one as a student teacher. But it is a really, really terrific opportunity to work with a colleague, a peer, a mentor to be able to figure out this maze of how to serve twice exceptional students. I will just put it on teachers' radars and college students. As I said earlier, it's going to be a lot of work as is the case with so much in education. I think at the end of the day, the end of the week, and the end of the semester, one will walk away going, "Oh man, I'm just exhausted every single day." But that was really cool. When you see the lights go on, you see the learning. It can be very rewarding, and I know we've heard that over and over in our careers, but it can be it can really be a fabulous semester. There are also gifts that the twice exceptional student can bring to the classroom to supplement some of the teacher's efforts. So it's a symbiotic relationship. And we need to do our best with all students, not to hide their gifts or their special talents. And so I like to highlight those in the class rather than look at this as, oh my gosh, this is going to be a huge burden. So, embrace the challenge. And I think it really can bring along and help a young student teacher's talents develop in more ways than just would be challenged by a quote unquote typical class, which we never see.
Yeah, and that's those are great suggestions and ideas. Thank you. And I loved that being proactive.
Mhm.
And I have a doctoral student from Cyprus who I'm
Mhm.
working with, and she's studying gifted in early childhood and twice exceptional. And when I told her I was doing this podcast with you, Dr. Chamberlain, she said, "Oh my gosh, I have so many questions." And she
Yeah.
sent me an email with maybe like a dozen questions to
Yep.
ask you. I think I'll forward you the email
Cool.
because
That would be fine.
there's a lot of questions she's
Yep.
got. But one of them is about early identification.
Yep.
How do you identify and detect early on? And is earlier better? Is it like with other areas of development and learning? The earlier you identify it, the better? Or like, what are your thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
I tend to think so because that enables parents in coordination with a teacher or teachers to serve in an advocacy role to try to leverage services that are available within a school, again, either private or public. Um, One of the things that we're pretty sure, and you could talk about this a little bit too, but one of the things that we're pretty confident about, in fact, ironically, yesterday in the afternoon, I was talking to a colleague in Fort Collins, Colorado, who's a Psych D, and he just does assessments effectively. And we were talking about the fact that really, really early measures aren't typically as reliable, dependable, and just as psychometrically solid as they are even when a student gets to second or third grade. So many parents, I think, who are dialed into this idea of the student being twice exceptional, if they're not accustomed or they're not acquainted with the whole construct of twice exceptionality, will be really, really confused because they might look at their student or their young, child at home and say, "Oh my gosh, she's capable of this." But that can't be the case that she's advanced because she struggles with X. And so we tend as a society, even teachers and to parents, this is complete taboo that that these things are mutually exclusive. You can't have a gift and you can't have a particular need in an area, and that's just plain and simple not the truth. We see this from time to time. So, couple of thoughts to keep in mind.
Yes, those are great thoughts to keep in mind. And also, your CAIMPS assessment tool,
Mhm.
how did you, this wasn't one of the questions,
That's fine.
sorry.
Oh,
How
we're
did
going
you
off
get
script. This
interested
isn't good.
in,
No, that's fine.
yeah, how did you get interested in assessment?
It arose from my dissertation work, and so I created an instrument to be able to assess students' interest as they were solving or at the conclusion of solving model eliciting activities. So these are mathematical activities that are more like they take more like 40 to 45 minutes to solve, and students generate a mathematical model to make sense of data or phenomena or to advance their understanding of mathematics. And one of the hypotheses in working with my committee was that they tend to work similarly well because they almost have I refer to as built-in differentiation. So they have components in them that enable students and learners to access them at various levels. So our hypothesis was, which was shown to be the case, was that these could be used with general education students and then with gifted students, even in the same setting, and they would be similarly challenged, which happened to be the case. So that then sort of just expanded to work in affect in general. And so the model that I use or the framework that I use is from two authors, Sid Bork and Lauren Anderson from 2000, actually. And they wrote a really, really great book called Assessing Affective Characteristics in School Children or something to that effect, or in schools or something. And they had so there are these subcomponents of affect. So affect essentially is feelings, emotions, dispositions, attitudes, beliefs, like that. But they had 8 components, and I just focused on interest in mine. Trying to think, I'm on the spot. I'm sure I won't remember these. There's um, aspiration, attitude, anxiety. There's interest, locus of control, self-esteem, self-efficacy, and value. I guess I did get all 8. But um, and the research points to the fact, and this actually, you may ask later, how can people follow me? This hopefully will be the next book proposal that I'm already starting to work on. We tend to see traditionally when affective ratings, not surprisingly, are predominantly positive, more enhanced educational outcomes, right, and byproducts, whether it's achievement, learning, however that is measured. There are a few things that society as a whole has written about as being really negative and they're horrible, and we should go to the ends of the earth to try to eliminate these to the greatest extent possible. But one of those that I contest is not wholeheartedly altogether terrible is anxiety. We know this in borrowing some theory from the world of sports psychology that a modicum of anxiety is actually good. As an example, when most of us learn, we do have a short period of sort of, for lack of a better term, like uncomfortableness because we're trying to figure out stuff and there's a little bit of anxiety and we're kind of, it bothers us and we really want to figure it out. And then we reach what was historically referred to like 40 or 50 years ago as a eureka moment, and more currently, it's called an aha moment where we have a breakthrough and we're like, oh my gosh, I figured this out, and we can do this with all sorts of things. It doesn't have to just be a mathematical problem solving task, but that's when we see throughout an activity, we see peaks and valleys of affect. And so affect isn't just completely stable throughout the whole thing. And then to overlay one more point with that is that affect is um, situational or permanent. So, for instance, if you try a new food, it's incredibly situational. I've never had this type of food. I don't know if I like this. Maybe I do. I might try another bite, right? And the more and more experiences we have with X, like anything for that matter, whether it's food or who knows what, public speaking, solving math problems, artwork, whatever, the more stable that becomes, right? So our affect becomes not sort of immovable, but it's just really, really hard to move the dial. As a consequence, it's been hypothesized that it's awful when students have a bad teacher for 1 year, but when they have a bad teacher in one subject for 2 or 3 years, it can have a tendency to sort of turn them off to that domain. The other thing that we know is that, at least in mathematics, but it's been hypothesized in other domains, that affect tends to be um, positive up to about fourth or fifth grade, and then for those for whom it turns negative, it happens often in fifth, sixth, or even early seventh grade. And so then by about seventh or eighth or ninth, it becomes incredibly stable. So it again, not immovable, but difficult to change once one gets to about eighth or ninth grade. So most people have, if they aren't interested in math in high school, have kind of talked themselves out of the fact that they're a mathematician by the time they get to high school.
Yes, that's so interesting.
Or the counter, they have decided they like math and they're good at it, or whatever that affective state may be.
Well, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about mentorships. Did you have a mentor that changed your life?
I thought about this in a couple of ways. Um, just from really, really early on in life, which had very little to do with academics. I would say there was a high school coach, his name was Fritz Nursty, and then a brother-in-law, Max Huff. I worked for him during the summers, well, actually throughout the whole year in high school, but then also in throughout the summers in college. But I think more than anything else, they just instilled in me the value of hard work. I guess parents and others in our community did as well, but those were probably the two that stick out. That I wouldn't say anything can be accomplished, but that hard work is sort of a prerequisite for success. And then I think as I got in more to academics, probably my chair Sydney Moon was brilliant. She is a world-renowned expert in the world of gifted education, and she taught me a lot, not about research, but she taught me voluminous amounts about expectations because her expectations were incredibly high. And what I suspected, I remember going into my defense, what I suspected one time she confirmed maybe a week or two before my defense, which is, and I'd heard other professors tell me this, but she told me point blank, and she wasn't arrogant about it. She was just very matter of fact about it. She said, when you meet my expectations, it's incredibly likely you're going to pass your defense. So don't have anxiety about passing your defense. We have gone over and over and over and over this. It's extremely tight. We've dotted our I's and crossed our T's, and this is going to be true, and which is what happened. But she taught me a lot about expectations, and there are all sorts of things on the periphery of affect, right? So expectations and how we can manipulate, hopefully in a positive way, students' performance through the use of expectations. There are other things that don't go in the formal literature of affect, like happiness or caring and a couple of other things. But I learned a lot, I think, just through the whole journey, through teaching also, about how to motivate students, really. But those are probably three that come to mind.
And Dr. Sydney Moon was at Purdue.
Yeah, she is. Yeah, she was and has since retired somewhat recently.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, as a mentor yourself, what's the biggest lesson you've learned?
Instilling a lot of those things that motivated me. But the other side of the coin is not everyone works in precisely the same way. So what motivates me or you may not work for somebody else. I also have, I mean, I don't know how many stories I could tell. The podcast wouldn't hold them all. I also have, I don't know how many stories about it is when I work with someone, I wouldn't say it's the biggest pleasure in the world to work with me or honor or anything, but I expect people to be highly motivated themselves. So if I work with you as a co-author or if I work with a graduate student, there is a component of, or, there at least a modicum of responsibility has to be incumbent upon the graduate student to be able to realize success. So, and I will work with knowing a bit about, so my PhD is in educational psychology, knowing a bit about motivation, and motivation is another term for affect. I would rather have someone who's, if they were lacking in one area, maybe slightly less capable in statistics or in writing or whatever, that's highly motivated, than someone with this really, really, depth of skills and a wide range of abilities, I mean, a wide range of skills in all sorts of areas that's not motivated. I just don't work well with people who aren't motivated. I used to coach in college and in high school, and I just have a really short fuse for unmotivated people, and I'll try to motivate them a few times, but after that, I just don't. I really have a short fuse for such individuals, but others who will put in the work, who are motivated, who will work hard and work towards the goal and will work to improve their craft in many areas, perhaps as they're working on a PhD, or even if they're a fifth or sixth grade math student. I really, really embrace those and we work well together. That's just my work style, though.
Yes. Did you ever see that movie Stand and Deliver? Came out like in the late 80s
Yes.
with oh gosh, I forgot his name.
Edward James almost.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Bravo. Yes.
Yeah.
That
That's the way he
movie.
was kind of in that movie.
Yeah. And he
Yeah.
was a math teacher like you.
Yeah.
And based on a true story. And he brought students' math scores. People
Mhm.
had such low expectations for these students, and he brought their math score. He helped
Yep.
them. And Jaime Escalante, that was his name.
Yes. That was
Jaime,
the guy's real name. Yeah.
yeah,
Parts
the
of it are
teacher.
Hollywoodized. There's a part in there, to me, the part that I love more than any other, and it's like a tearjerker moment, is so his students all take the Calc 1 test. And they had the Calc 1 AP test, and he had like 15 students pass it or something. It's somewhere on in South Central or in East LA or in not a particularly good part of town. And so the AP board came back and accused them of cheating. And so he did stand up to them and he said they didn't cheat. And so most of these kids I think had been told their whole life you can't do this. And that has which has to do with expectations too. And we think you cheated and blah blah blah. And so he said, we're gonna, basically he said we're gonna double down and we're gonna pass it again. And they had all these AP people come in and watch the test and blah 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 blah. And
Yes. Well, and
um
when you were talking about motivation, that's what made me
yeah,
think of the movie because
right,
in the
yeah,
movie, uh, Mr. Escalante says, ganas, you got to have
yeah,
ganas.
yeah,
And in Espanol, ganas means motivation.
right.
And you have to have the desire. It has to
You
come from,
definitely do. So, but the cool thing at the end of that scene is then they're reading the scores after they'd taken it the second time. And several of the students actually perform better. Most perform the same. So I don't know if do you remember what he said at the end of that?
uh, the part where he said, you got to have ganas.
No, after the scores were read, he said, I want the initial scores reinstated.
I need to go back and watch it again.
Yeah,
It's been a couple of years, but I think every
yeah.
teacher should watch that
It's
movie
pretty
or
cool.
read the
And
book.
yeah, it's a
And
little Hollywoodized, but it's quite cool that that guy was an advocate. And he was a guy in industry that wasn't formally trained as a teacher. He just, ran himself ragged to help students succeed.
yes, he cared about
Kind
students
of
so
cool.
much.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I thought was so cool was when the United States Postal Service
Uh-huh.
put him on a
Yeah.
stamp.
Yeah.
Jaime Escalante was
Yeah.
on a stamp.
Quite
Well,
cool. Yeah.
yeah. Well, Dr. Chamberlain, what new practices in teaching or innovations excite you today?
So my lens is working on some of the things that almost indirectly influence teaching. So, a couple of things come to mind. I'll mention a curriculum, but then I'll mention something from the research world that I think has the ability to impact teaching, learning, and instruction dramatically. I'm really, really into mathematical modeling because I had a person on my committee who was one of the world-renowned, like the expert in that. His name's Richard Lesh, and we've just found it to be so incredibly powerful. One of the real values of the activities that we created when I was in grad school is that it has the potential to identify students who are prospectively gifted that don't show up on traditional assessments. A lot like those kids in Stand and Deliver that before Jaime Escalante got there just wouldn't have fared very well in mathematics, but the ability was still there. Talent level was still there. So model eliciting activities specifically are a really, really great vehicle for identifying under-identified or underserved students. From an assessment perspective, one of the things that's happened probably in the last 20 to 25 years, and I worked on a little bit of this too, is taking something that we consider a real fuzzy construct in psychology and quantifying it. So there are things in the world that are really, really easy to quantify, your height and mine, or other things. And then there are things that are really, really challenging to quantify, right? And some of these have to do with affect. So one of the examples that I often use at conferences, you'll hear someone say, you are going to completely love this curriculum. It's fabulous. It's going to change. It's going to be life changing. It's going to change the way your students learn. And, blah, blah, blah. And they'll talk about, and they'll use the word love. And then they'll say, they'll be talking to somebody else. The presenter will be talking to someone else after the presentation, say, oh, I just completely love my dog. And so, how do we quantify one's passion for something or one's lack of interest or motivation in something, right? And so, we've gotten better as of the world of psychology, the domain of psychology and educational psychology, of quantifying and putting numbers on these things, which has direct benefits in the classroom, right? So if you're a beginning teacher and you find out, the student's not particularly capable in, subjects A, B, and C, but he or she is has incredible aptitude and desire to learn about mechanics, right? Maybe mechanical engineering, maybe the mechanics of how a car or a boat or whatever runs. So there are some talents there. And so to be dialed into, we are such a society, America's horrible at this, and many other countries are too. We are such a society in which we are results driven. So we pay attention to IQ, we pay attention to performance on achievement tests, and all sorts of other academic data. But we don't get what Simon and Binet, now actually over 100 years ago in 1916, referred to as non-intellectual factors. And they even contested the creators of the IQ test. You would think nothing is more important to them, right? Than intelligence quotient. Said in 1916 in a publication, um, non-intelligence factors not that can't be quantified in intelligence are just incredibly important. And so fast forward to 1979, a guy named Messick talked about, a professor named Messick referred to them as non-cognitive factors. And so to say that things like affect have no importance in the classroom or in the learning equation is just incredibly, incredibly naive. By the way, one of the things that we find is affect at either end of the spectrum when they're or either end of the continuum when they're really, really far removed from the median can influence. We have a tendency to think, well, super positive affect would be great for learning. Not necessarily. You know, I've had students who come into the college classroom and they just got engaged over the weekend. They couldn't be happier. They learn absolutely nothing. It's not their fault. I understand why they're happy. And students who are disengaged due to negative, super negative affect also don't learn well. So there is kind of a sweet spot in there where students need to be provided with accurate data, but teachers also need to be provided with accurate data. It can provide feedback on whether the curriculum they're using resonates with students. It can provide, data on all sorts of things, and it can help us refine teaching from the art that it is with a little bit of science to a much more scientific approach.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, Dr. Chamberlain, what's been the highlight of your career so far?
Oh man, I don't know. Maybe having the opportunity to meet some individuals that I have and to work closely. I guess a guy named Richard Lesh, some call him Dick Lesh. He's retired and he is back in Indiana. And then just some folks that I've had the opportunity to meet. Julian Stanley did a very, very heavily cited the early work in mathematics education with gifted students called the SMPY, Study for Mathematically Precocious Youth, out of Johns Hopkins, and now that is housed at Vanderbilt. He's since passed away. I got to meet him shortly before he died, maybe 15 years ago, and that was really, really cool. But I mean, I could point to any number of other things, just having great colleagues to work with and some accomplishments on Avita, being promoted to professor status, book contracts, all sorts of other things. But I just think a lot of it has been the opportunity to learn from eminent individuals in the field and to be able to, sometimes sitting down and talking with somebody for an hour um, is, is so much more insightful than reading their book. Um, so Zalman Yusiskin, who is semi-retired at the University of Chicago, he's now upwards of 90. I had the opportunity, I was at a conference in Las Vegas, work with a group called International Group for Math, Creativity, and Giftedness. And he attended that conference in Las Vegas in 2022. And he came up to, speaking of three different generations, he came up to a graduate student with whom I was working at the time, who was an undergrad here, and I was on his master's committee. And since graduated at Utah State, I was on his PhD committee. And Zalman Yusiskin said, "Would you guys like to get together after this next session for dinner?" And so
Oh,
it was a really, really cool opportunity to just interact. And we get to do this in academics under the right circumstances to interact with, a real visionary in a field. And I don't know that there are many other vocations or professions in which you just cross paths with someone at a conference and say, "Could I sit down for a half an hour and talk with you?" And for the record, I have had a handful of opportunities where someone has sort of politely or impolitely said, "No, I don't have time for you," and that never happens really, it seems like in academia, if the person is approached in the right. I like to think of myself in the same way. I don't really think of myself as having accomplished a lot, but I get people from all over the world. I'm working with a graduate student in the Philippines now, somebody in Australia. If your student from Cyprus emails me, I'll try to Zoom or respond to whatever questions they have because that was the way people were to me, I guess.
Yes, that's awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
Uh, and well, it makes me tear up thinking that the highlight of your career is meeting and seeing these trailblazers in our
Oh
field.
yeah. Yeah.
And it is so
Yeah.
inspiring to see other people who are like personal heroes and role
Yeah.
models and
Yeah.
watch them shine
Hmm.
and get to see them at a conference. And then when
Yeah.
you find out that, oh my gosh, they are human, they want to
Oh
have
yeah.
dinner with me.
Yeah.
And it's really, really
Very
cool.
surprising to us, isn't it, sometimes?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Dr. Chamberlain.
Hmm.
Well, how can listeners follow you and your work and uh,
Well, as a practicing Amish person, not really. I don't. I actually don't really use social media. I joke because I grew up. I told my class yesterday we were doing a quilting problem. It was a model-eliciting activity. That I said I grew up with, and I did actually grow up with a ton of Amish, and so I don't really use much social media. But people, honest to gosh, I don't. I hope you don't have 4 million listeners. That would be great for you. But people are welcome to email me if they have any questions. My email is just scott@uwyo.edu. If people just want to randomly email me and say I had a question about this, you might identify, no, Marisa does not get a bonus on this one, but you might identify yourself as someone who listened to the podcast, so I'll have a context of how you got a hold of me. But um, I am hoping to send in a book proposal soon. I want to address anxiety. I don't know if it'll be anxiety, probably anxiety predominantly in math, but anxiety in learning in general. Have a number of other books out there with different publishers, Routledge, Springer. I've done some that are practitioner oriented and others that are very academically inclined. And I have a couple of journal articles coming out soon. But I mean, if people really have a question about something relevant to this, something in gifted ed at the intersection of gifted ed or math, don't be shy about sending me an email. And I would actually, I know it sounds weird in this day and age. Instead of having 45,000 followers, I'd rather just people email me individually. That's maybe a 1980s perspective, 90s, but I'd rather, interact with people, sort of one to one either. And I have even known to Zoom with people if they have enough questions. Um, but so I thank you for the opportunity. Any other questions at
yeah.
all?
Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you,
You
thank
bet.
you. And uh, so I can put that in the show notes if
Sure.
you want, or
That's fine. Yeah, that is
it's
fine.
easy enough. People can go to the University of
Most
Wyoming
assuredly. Yep.
website, School of Teacher Education,
Yep.
and you can find Dr. Chamberlain that way too. Well,
Bob,
thanks
do a
a
good job
million.
editing this.
Thanks a million,
Thank you
Dr.
very much. Have a good
Chamberlain.
day.
It's great talking to you.